Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And when I first started Resonators, my general expectation was that I was going in cold to the albums I was going to be covering. I might recognize a couple singles or songs from punk compilations, but beyond that, I wasn't really going to be familiar with the albums I would be exploring at length. But there was always going to be one exception. And it's the album we're talking about today. And to explain why it's an exception, we need to go back to 2015, when I reviewed a little album called Return to the Moon by Elvi, a side project from the frontman of The National, Matt Berninger, and a member of Minutemen. That's one of the most criminally underrated satirical projects of the decade, not to mention one of the best albums that came out in 2015. Now, throughout that album, Matt Berninger repeatedly made reference to the band we're going to be talking about today. Minutemen, an early signee to SST who started putting out records in the early 80s, alongside with Black Flag and even having Spot on production. But it rapidly became apparent that for as quick as Minutemen were in cranking out songs, they were significantly more ambitious than the majority of the hardcore punks that we have covered on this show, dabbling with some bassy post-punk even earlier, and picking up chunks of jazz and soul and funk and experimental rock as they move forward. Now, of course, it really helped the band was crazy good, thanks to D. Boone's jittery guitar work and wild guttural vocals, Mike Watt's frenetic bass work, and George Hurley's pretty damn solid and underrated drum work, all which fed into songs that could be as witty and genuinely funny as they were catchy and conscious. This was a group that relied a lot more on raw wit than bellicose presence, making their first two albums, both well deserving of a lot of critical acclaim, really stand out amongst a lot of their peers of that time. And yet, in 1983, when they heard that their label mates Husker Du were putting out a double album, they went back to the studio to expand that single disc they had right then into what some have held up not just as a hardcore punk classic, but one of the best records of the 1980s. A 4-disc, 80-minute behemoth overstuffed with ideas, inside jokes, and off-kilter abstraction. And it's this album for which I started exploring back when I covered Elvi in 2015, and now I'm back 3 years later to finish the job. That's right, folks, we're talking about Minutemen's third album, Double Nickels on the Dime, and this is Resonators. Now, one thing that I wanted to focus on in the second half of Resonators in 2018 was the records that pushed hardcore punk a little bit outside of its comfort zone. The 6 acts that I've covered thus far, from Black Flag to Descendants to Bad Brains, while they were even deviating from the pure hardcore punk formula even then, they were instrumental in setting more of the groundwork in the scene in which Minutemen felt comfortable releasing this album, some which have heralded as the zenith of hardcore punk experimentation in the 1980s, others the beginning of the end for the genre mutating and then fading a little bit throughout the rest of the 80s. It's also the first time I'm not talking about a full-length debut project. Don't worry, I went back and re-listened to The Punchline and What Makes a Man Start Fires a couple of times. They're genuinely solid albums, but I would be hard-pressed to call either of them truly exceptional. Ridiculously tight, really witty, really funny, absolutely. And I liked how their sophomore project got a little bit darker and rougher and grittier, just a shade slower to show off some of the melodic chops, but I wouldn't quite put them among my favorites, although that sophomore album did show off a thematic complexity that did herald a lot of what was going to be coming. But Double Nickels on the Dime. The first thing to note here is that it's split across 4 distinct discs, one named for each member of the band, and one purely what they themselves described as throwaway songs, and that's the sort of thing for a quadruple album that already is over an hour raised some questions of indulgence, especially in hardcore punk. It was also not produced by Spot, instead opting for a relative unknown producer named Ethan James, which they contributed a few songs to a compilation he was putting together, and they were so impressed with his work that they brought him on board. And when you factor in how the album includes instrumental cuts, live cuts, and covers, you gotta wonder whether Minutemen didn't expect to release anything else after this project, just to cover all their bases one last final hurrah. But it does present a bit of a complication in discussing the album as a whole. There's over 40 songs on this project, most running under 2 minutes, and the more listens I gave it, the more I got the impression that highlighting individual songs within the album isn't really the point of how it's meant to be listened to, which already sets it in a very different lane compared to more song or single-driven hardcore punk albums that I've covered thus far. Something that Minutemen themselves recognized by releasing the Wheel of Fortune EP that contains 9 of the more accessible cuts from the project for mainstream radio promotion. But that EP is not what I'm covering here. I'm instead talking about the 80-plus minutes of fragmented twisted but tangled hardcore punk. Made all the more complicated for me because when you start really digging into the content, Double Nickels on the Dime kind of resist easy analysis. Music critics of the time described this album more close to free verse poetry, and I definitely see it, given that the lyrical hooks are mostly set aside for interweaving snapshots that blur together as they speed past, which kind of makes sense for a record named for going 55 miles an hour on the I-10 going home to San Pedro. And while this album doesn't quite have the instrumental feel of a road trip record, I'll come back to this, but it's more that it's a little bit more jagged and experimental, doesn't quite altogether cultivate those driving grooves, but it's hard to ignore how it does capture the blur of contradicting ideas driving across middle America in the mid-1980s. And what's genuinely impressive is how the band is keenly aware of some of these contradictions, even circling back to the band themselves. So while there is a defiant leftward slant across significant chunks of the record, because of course these guys get political and they are really quite good at it, the second disc named for Mike Watt is much more interested in postmodern deconstruction and digging into his role feeding into those defective systems. Sure, they will take pot shots at the failure of the United States of America in the Vietnam War and destabilizing the reach of the Soviet Union and communism, and then there's a lot of increased anger at a pop industry, really a culture industry in the mid-80s that was all about doubling down on oversold, exaggerated American exceptionalism while ignoring chunks of the country that were sliding into decay and getting ignored. But even there, they'll question their own agency in that exploitative capitalist system. And by the time we hit the second disc, it's hard not to see the band start to retreat into higher abstraction surrounding the postmodern deconstruction of free will in the face of the few universal truths they can perceive throughout history, and even then, they're still questioning what they're perceiving. But what I really love about the group is that they're empathetic enough to be very conscious of the consequences of their involvement in that system to others, especially outside the United States and Latin America or Mexico. But they're also self-aware enough to take a step back, re-ground themselves in the concerns of everybody else. And one of the most memorable points on the record, they swap out the lyrics of Take 5D as being perceived as too spacey for a scrambled note surrounding a leaking shower from a friend's landlady, the common concerns that everybody faces, showing a renewed commitment to both reality then and now and the other people around them, and that sense of populism. And what that might serve as an internal climax point for most records in terms of thematic emotion, it's only the halfway mark for Double Nickels on the Dime, as then we snap back to the sharper picture of middle America and a lot of their panicked observations of the hard rightward shift that's taking a deeper hold in some parts of culture. Topical. And what gives the third disc such potency for me is the sense of desperate momentum. From earlier on the album, they seem firmly aware of their current state, that they can probably avoid the majority of the systemic rot and oppression. They're white boys in California, they'll be fine, but others, they can avoid it. And they're concerned about society's inability to change or accept responsibility for it, or even acknowledge that it exists in the first place. That's a huge barrier, which leads them to hypothesize that in order to express some of those concepts in their truest form, the language might not even exist yet. And to some extent, that was very true, as the examination of societal privilege only really started receiving academic study in the late 80s, and it wouldn't enter mainstream discourse for decades later, only really coming out now. Yeah, Webb Du Bois was writing about it in the early 1900s, but that isn't really in the mainstream. The Minutemen were ahead of their time. And by the time we get to the fourth disc here, things kind of slip off the rails a bit. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate some of the off-kilter pivots there, but between the covers and the numerous instrumental packages, especially the ones that end out the album, it never quite picks up the same thematic weight and intensity as the earlier discs, and I would probably treat the entire piece as a tacked-on extra. Now granted, it's a pretty damn great tacked-on extra, but that's because Minutemen are operating damn near the peak with their release, especially when you consider the production and the compositions, which indeed are kind of tricky to talk about when pointing to specific songs because of how so much of the album just flows together in hooks after hooks. I will say, if you're expecting a conventional, furious, hardcore punk release, or even a road album, this album will throw you a curveball immediately with the cleaner bass line and the more intricate rhythm sections that, with Boone's yelping delivery, probably owes more to the Talking Heads than Black Flag. But when you combine it with the crazy, intricate guitar passages that a lesser punk band wouldn't even be able to play, or maybe they would stretch out one hook to hammer into the ground, it's hard not to be in awe of how Boone just blows blows through them in fragments, only just to leap onto the next one with hook after hook after hook. And by the time we get to the first intricate acoustic instrumental piece, you know that you're dealing with a virtuoso here behind the guitar, where Mike Watt's bass is often responsible for holding the primary melodic foundation, where Boone's guitar work and Hurley's more frenetic drum fills will just leap all over the damn place. And that's before you get the tonal switch-ups that owe as much to jazz or funk as they do to classic southern rock or surf rock or even country timbres as they do to hardcore punk. And amidst all of this, we got D. Boone's delivery, which, yeah, it's far from the most visceral or savage or distinct within hardcore punk of the time. Hell, at some points it got the same conversational, yelping vibe as David Byrne's did, but it fits the cleaner brand of more literate hardcore that the band utilizes, emphasizing the everyman presence that gives the record so heavily deconstructionist a real populist, accessible edge, and I absolutely appreciate they have that lane for themselves. Now, all that being said, the record is not without its experimental detours, and not all of them quite stick the landing. I mean, I might love the blur bass and the guitar textures that build up the subtle royal of percussion on Do You Want New Wave or Do You Want the Truth? And then following it with a straight live cutter of Creedence Clearwater Revival's Don't Look Now. It frankly works way better than it's got any right to. And then you get the second disc, which actually has the balls to retreat into rougher but surprisingly restrained hardcore passages that they will get increasingly tangled and high concept. It's probably still my favorite of the 4 discs, and not just because Corona eventually became the Jackass theme. I imagine most of you probably don't know that. And it's a similar case with a considerable section of the 3rd disc as well, where you probably find some of the strongest individual songs on cuts like Themselves and This Ain't No Picnic. And I already mentioned how much Take 5 Deep just clicks for thematic coherence within the album, even if it is one of the more slapdash instrumental cuts here, if I'm being honest. And while I could go on forever about how History Lesson Part 2 is so beautifully poignant and recentering on the band in that moment of quiet personal focus, just a great breathing moment at the end of the disc, when you follow it the half-scatting acoustic jaggedness of You Need the Glory, not likely one of the best choices, even if it is quickly redeemed by The Roar of the Masses Could Be Farts right afterwards. Again, this band's got a great sense of humor and it comes out at just the right moments. And yet again, while the main 3 discs are damn near flawless in their own way, the 4th disc does feel like a cross-section of throwaways. Really good throwaways, mind you, but it's hard to ignore that it's a bit indulgent, and if they weren't included, this might well be damn close to getting a perfect score. That's right, a 10 out of 10. It's so close. And yet that said, well, I love Double Nickels on the Dime back in 2015 when I reviewed Elvi in the first place for its wit and its flair and its insane overstuffed catchiness, so many hooks. The layered deconstructionist approach and the fiercely beating heart of human empathy and social awareness makes the album feel even more poignant and relevant today, with few, if any, of the historical reference points feeling dated at all. As a record, it is aged unbelievably well. It's also yet sadly proven to be one of the last from Minutemen within hardcore punk. One more genuinely excellent album and 3-way tie for last in 1985, mostly of covers and more of an alternative college rock vein. And then tragically, D. Boone was killed in a van accident that same year at the age of 27, which led to the band dissolving immediately. But their legacy lives on with Double Nickels on the Dime, which is absolutely getting a strong 9 out of 10, and of course a recommendation as a hardcore punk classic that lives up to it. Now, where the genre would go from there, it's an open question, but in terms of a high artistic watermark, Minutemen, they set it, and few have ever come close to matching it. So if you haven't heard it, take an hour, maybe a little bit more, check this out. It's an experience that's worth having. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this one's a long one. I had a lot to say. This was a really long record, and there's a lot to really deconstruct here, and it's really so worth it. But if you want to buy the record, links down there below. Highly recommend you do. Not enough people have heard this record. And then I've got the poll up there. I know it's a classic, and I know most of you guys might agree with me there, but I'm curious where the rest of you are going to fall on this, because again, it is a very different hardcore release. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in the scheduling process or help vote for the next episode of Resonators, link to my Patreon right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right there. You want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.